state climatologist with the Colorado Climate Center at Colorado State University. And I'm going to kind of go over what we've seen so far this this water year, starting back from October 1st, 2022, where we currently are and what we might be seeing as we go into the fall and winter. So pretty picture I took of some Amatis clouds at sunset. We've had a really active thunderstorm season this year, so I had lots of good pictures to share. And this section, I'm going to kind of talk about what we've seen so far in the water year and what we saw specifically this summer. So water year 2023 has been wetter than average for a lot of areas around the state. The map on the right shows the ranking of precipitation from October 2022, the beginning of water year, through the end of August. So that 11 months, how did the temperature rank in the NOAA gridded data set 128-year record? So where you see the greens means it ranked in the wetter categories. As the greens get darker, that was a higher rank. So you could be in the top 20, the top 10, and then that darkest green, which you see focused over southern Weld County into Adams and Arapahoe County and down into Elbert County, is record wet conditions. So for that 11-month time period out of 128 years, this is the wettest that it's been. And so very wet for the Northeast, wetter ranking in the Southeast, down in the Southwest along the West Slope in certain areas. And then on the flip side, where we see those brown colors means we have seen some drier conditions when we look at that 11-month period. So we haven't had record dry anywhere, but we have been in the top 10 driest for parts around Alamosa specifically and into the San Luis Valley, also around the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. So this is a look at the statewide precipitation ranks. The top left is for August specifically, and then the bottom left is for the summer. So you can see where all the states ranked, where were those dry pockets, where was it wetter. For our summer precipitation, we ranked 100th, which was slightly above average, and it probably would have been a lot wetter had it not been for some of those dry pockets that we had. If we look specifically at August, it was right in that near average range, 58th wettest. That table on the right shows that that ranking for each individual month in the water year. So you can see there's a couple of little bit dry ones, July and April. We've had a lot of near average ones that are gray. And then we've had quite a few wet months, which is nice to see, you know, throughout the water year there. So we know the precipitation rank was that 58th wettest for August. How did that look across the state? So this is showing that ranking specifically for last month. So you can see that wetter rankings up in the northern mountains, the northern plains. Near average is that white, so pretty much in that middle range for a lot of the state. A few minor dry pockets, and then the focus of the driest area in the San Luis Valley. We'll switch over and talk about temperature. Same map, but for temperature. So this is looking at the water year from October through the month of August. What has the ranking of our temperatures been? We need somebody on mute here. Okay. So when we look at the temperature ranking for the state, we see a lot of white, so very near average. And a lot of that has been because we had a lot of colder than average temperatures. And then more recently, we've seen a few warmer than average that's kind of averaged it out to show in that white category. But I will point out that in the Northeast Plains, you see that blue there, solid blue, showing that we've had those colder temperature rankings going along with the wet conditions in the Northeast part of the state. So this is a look at the statewide temperature rankings, the top left again just for August, and then the bottom left for the summer, June, July, August. And so if we look at the summer, we see that it ranked in that slightly above average category with 96th warmest in the 128-year record. Or wait, that would not be 96th warmest, that would be 96th coldest. And I can't do my math to subtract from 129, but there it is. So if we look at the top left, specifically August, we see that it ranked in the much above average category. And it was the 10th warmest in that 129-year record for the state. That table on the right shows that breakdown of month by month. This is not something you're going to see very often. We generally tend to have water years with a lot more of the warm colors because we experience a lot more above average temperature months rather than below average temperature months. So this has been quite the anomalous water year to see that we have 5 of the months ranking in that below average category, and then another 3 months in the near average category. And we've only had 3 months this water year that have been in those above average categories. How did it look across the state for August? We know it was the 10th warmest August on record, and we can see that pretty much over the entire state, except when you do look at the Eastern Plains and in Northeast Colorado, those warm temperature ranks are not quite as high or in that near average category. But across all of Western Colorado and most of Southern Colorado, we're seeing those warm temperature ranks in a couple of spots in Southern Colorado where we see that record warmest August popping up there in those ranks. All right, so let's dive into some current conditions, looking at temperature and precipitation still, but also looking at evaporative demand and soil moisture and vegetation, how things are looking as we are going into the fall, further into the fall and towards the cold season. So this is a look at the map of the daily temperature anomalies that we have experienced pretty much since the beginning of September across the state. So if you see those oranges to reds, that would be above average temperatures to the beginning of the month. And then the blues are below average. And we don't really have much to talk about. It's been very seasonal. We've had some warm days, we've had some cooler days, and that's really averaged out to where we don't see a lot of color on this map, or the colors we do see are very light, which leads me to believe that right now, if we were to end the month the way that we started the month, we would have a near average month. We would probably not have, we would not add another above average month to that monthly table of temperature ranks. Here is month-to-date precipitation. So from September 1st, and this one goes through September 17th. What are the total precipitation accumulations we've seen? So the shading in the background is our gridded prism precipitation product. And then the individual dots are co-op or CoCoRaHS observations to kind of give you some ground truth of what the grid is showing. And then if you see the yellow lines, that's where we have our drought categories right now. So the most important thing to point out with this map is that there's a lot of color on it. We have continued to see a lot of precipitation activity across the state. Areas that haven't gotten quite as much around Grand Junction, towards Montrose a little, I'm having a hard time telling with all the color. And up in the Northwest, not quite as much, maybe in that 1/10 of an inch to 1/2 an inch range. But a lot of the state has seen 3/4 of an inch or more of precipitation for the month. Where we get into those purples, those are areas that have seen 2 inches or more. So we're still seeing that very active precipitation occurring. And this is kind of looking at some of those stats of our thunderstorm season, which has been incredibly active. So we have this great interactive map on our website, and I'm sorry I didn't include the link on here. I will include it when I share it with Emily so that you can explore this. It's a great tool here where you can actually look at the individual severe thunderstorm and flash flood reports across the state. This is through the 2023 season as of September 18th. So those green dots show where we've had hail reports. The blue dots are where we've had high wind reports. Red are tornadoes, and the maroon are flood and flash flood. So we've had pretty much all the reports and quite a bit of them. We had a EF3 tornado reported in Yuma County, I believe, which is the first EF2 we've had in quite a while, or EF3 we've had in quite a while. So we've had a lot of tornadoes and a lot of hail. So this one, I'm just zooming in to show you our large hail reports. So these are all the reports that were made that the hail report was at least 2 inches in diameter or larger, and very active across the Eastern Plains. You can see how even with active precipitation bringing moisture to a lot of the crop areas that we have in this area, unfortunately, that brought a lot of hail too, which probably that's a double-edged sword, probably not as helpful. So here are the stats for the season. I asked Russ if he could gather these up for me, that we had a total of 796 severe hail reports this year. That's a record. The records don't go back that far. I think they go back to 1998. And when you're talking about severe hail reports, it's kind of like if a tree falls in the forest, you only get those hail reports where people live or where people drive. So as we increase in population, it's easier to increase in hail reports, but that is quite a significant number. It beats our previous record high of 561 reports set in 2018. And there was a lot of large hail, so not just hail overall, but large hail. So we broke records with our 2-inch in diameter hail reports, our 3-inch diameter hail reports, and even our 4-inch diameter hail reports. So imagine a 4-inch diameter, you're talking baseball size, larger softball size, hitting down on your property. Our previous record of reports in 1 year was 5 in 2005. And this year we had 15. In that is included a new record hailstone diameter of 5.25 inches in Yuma County. So our previous record hailstone was discovered in 2019 near Bethune in eastern Colorado, and that was at 4.83 inches in diameter. The Storm Chaser got this one at 5.25 inches. And so we have the State Climate Extremes Committee currently going over that and assessing that. And that will likely be official in the record books the next coming month or so. So this past June had the most severe weather reports of any month on record, going back, about to 1998, with 310 reports. July and August will also end up in the top 10 most active with the most severe weather reports, and May ranked in the top 15. So very active season. Couple of other interesting statistics I wanted to show is our scatter plot of temperature and precipitation, specifically for the Platte drainage. So this is everywhere that drains into the South Platte River, so all of Northeast Colorado, the summer, June, July, August. The y-axis is for temperature, so as you go up, it's hotter, and then the x-axis is for precipitation, so as you go to the right, you get wetter. We have dashed lines on there to show you where the average precipitation is for the summer and the average temperature for the summer. And so you can see that we have a little bit of a slope there where you tend to have When it's dry, it tends to be warmer. When it's wet, it tends to be cooler, although you can really scatter into all those quadrants. We've had a lot of summers recently in that warm and dry quadrant in the upper left corner. And the star shows where we were for 2023, which was a very wet summer, not quite the wettest on record, but close, and also in that cooler quadrant. So this was a nice, refreshing summer of taking us out of that warm and dry quadrant and into that cool and wet quadrant. So now we're going to look at the standardized precipitation index, which is looking at the basically how abnormally dry or wet were conditions for the time period that we're looking at. So if you see greens, blues, and purples, that's in those abnormally wet categories. Gray is in the near normal range. And then the warm colors line up with our drought categories and show how you can get more abnormally dry. So this is looking at the last 30 days, basically from mid-August through mid-September. And you see a lot of greens as we go throughout the northern mountains, the northern plains, down across the southern Front Range and into the southeast plains. A lot of near normal conditions around the San Juan Mountains and in the San Luis Valley. Couple of dry spots over in Mesa County, but overall not too dry for the last 30 days. If we extend out to the last 90 days, so this is going back to mid-June, the official start of astronomical summer, we start to see a lot more of those dry conditions pop up in southern and southwest Colorado, particularly as we look in the San Luis Valley into the San Juan Mountains, up towards the Grand Mesa up there. We've had a lot of dry pockets, but continued wet throughout the northeast corner of the state, and not too bad in southeast Colorado as well. The final one that I wanted to show is the water year to date. So this is going back to October 1st, and this really highlights that dryness that we saw in the 90-day is really a short-term dry situation. It's not from long-term. We do have a couple of dry SPIs in the San Luis Valley still, largely driven by how dry it was in the summer. Overall, we see a lot of near normal conditions to wetter conditions. Most notably, if you look at the Northern Front Range urban corridor, we've got a lot of those purple colors, so very wet. And I wanted to focus in a little bit more. This is looking at Alamosa. They just had their driest summer on record, and this is how their precipitation accumulated since the beginning of the water year. So the gray dashed line is how they normally accumulate precipitation, and they should get about 7.5 to 8 inches for the water year. And the black line shows how they accumulated it this water year up through September 17th. So they've gotten 4.32 inches, which is 61% of their average. That long-term average at 7.39 inches again. And earlier in the year, you can kind of follow along with the projections, which is those blue and red and green colors. But since we're so close to the end of the water year, it only projects out for 2 weeks. So we know that it's very likely that they are going to end below average. Not very likely, absolutely they're going to end below average, probably around that 60% of average. And so you can see as you look into June through August, where they had a sustained time period of no precipitation or very little blips, which at the beginning of the summer, they were behind, but not that behind. And so this summer has really had a major impact on that. If you look in September, they've actually gotten quite a bit of moisture that really bumped them up, but not anywhere to get close to what is normal. On the flip side, we're going to go look at Campo, which is in southeast Colorado. And this one's an interesting one. I feel like I see this a lot at Campo, where as you go into the winter, it pretty much flatlines and you get almost no precipitation through the winter. So it was quite dry there as we went into the spring. And then the faucet turned on in May or late April and into May. And even though they were well below average, they have ended the season above average. And so they're currently at 125% of average, already over what they get in a water year, which is typically 16.61 inches. And most around the state, when you look at these precipitation accumulation graphs, show for the water year that they ended either near average or above average, with the notable exception of Alamosa. The other notable exception was Grand Lake in our northern mountains. As you get towards Middle Park, just out of Rocky Mountain National Park, we've had conditions that were near average, but have kind of tailed off this summer. And so they are going to end below average there as well, at about 77% of average. So we've talked about precipitation. Now we're going to talk about evaporation and what that has looked like for the summer. So the evaporative demand drought index is taking into account everything that goes into that, how much the atmosphere wants to take from the ground in terms of water. So how much are we losing from the ground? If there's water there, how much are we losing, or does the atmosphere want to take? And so this is looking at combination of how hot are the temperatures, how much sunshine are you getting, how dry is the relative humidity, and how windy is it? And those conditions are going to increase that evaporative demand. We know we already have normal evaporative demand in the summer because we're in a semi-arid climate, but anywhere where you see into those warm colors means higher evaporative demand than what we typically expect in that time period. So we're looking at the last 2 months here. So going from mid-July to mid-September, and across all of Western Colorado, we've seen that evaporative demand has been very high. And a lot of this has been due to the fact that we haven't had that strong monsoon season. Typically, when we have a strong monsoon season, we're raising those relative humidities. We expect we're going to see dew points in the mid 50s to low 60s regularly. When we don't get that, the air is drier. When we have that drier air and we're not getting that precipitation, that allows the temperatures to be warmer, and we get that anomalously high evaporative demand. As we go into eastern Colorado, where we've had a lot more of an active precipitation pattern, we don't see that anomalously high category. And in fact, if I extended this back to 3 months or 4 months, we would start to see blues in northeast Colorado because the evaporative demand has been so low. This has had an impact on the vegetation. So this is a product called the Vegetation Drought Response Index. Link you can find there from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And where you have those warm colors are where the vegetation is getting stressed. And this is a satellite-derived product, so it does look at precipitation and temperature, but it's also combining that information with what the satellites are viewing with the vegetation on the ground. And so we can see that drying of the vegetation happening around the southern mountains, around the west slope, and into the northwest mountains. We see that dry pocket basically from the East Troublesome burn scar in the northern mountains. And then we see a lot of greens where we've had that very active precipitation pattern. All right, so I'm sure you know, based on everything we've seen, where you're going to see the drought in the state. We're going to start with a look at the national picture. So looking across the contiguous United States, this map was released last Thursday. The next map comes out 2 days from now. This is what the drought depiction looks like. So we can see a lot of the very bad drought conditions occurring in Texas and Louisiana. We know that they've had that sustained heat dome there a lot of the summer in Texas. If you noticed on the map of precipitation ranks for August, Louisiana had its driest August on record. As we go into the upper Midwest, we also see a lot of dry conditions there, but really around us, there's not as much drought to talk about. Zooming in on Colorado, we can see that drought is focused over the southwest quadrant of the state. We do have some D1. D1 and D2 cover about 16% of the state, with almost 3% of the state in that D2 category. We've got 3 little blobs of D2 you can see there, and 31% of our state is in some dry or drought category. How has that changed since the beginning of the summer? This is showing the change map, which looks very similar, basically because we've had no changes over a lot of the state in the white, which is in no drought categories. In the northeast and southeast corner, we can see improvements from what they had remaining of drought at the beginning of summer. And then where we have those yellows and oranges are where we've seen the degradations, basically showing that all of this drought has developed since the beginning of summer, and actually really since since about early mid-July. This is how those drought categories have changed for the water years. So the percent of the state covered in those drought categories going back to October 1st on the left side of the graph, and going through where we currently are at in the right side of the graph. So you can see at the beginning of the water year, we had about 80% coverage in a dry or drought category, with about 40 to 50% in D1 to D3. And that red along the bottom there shows that we had some D3 somewhere in our state from the beginning of October through into May. But we had a lot of improvement happening in May and June. July, we went completely drought free, which I think lasted for 2 weeks maybe. And then we started introducing those dry and drought categories again. All right, we're going to continue on to what the outlook is showing us. Looking into the crystal ball here. We'll start with the 7-day forecast of precipitation. So this forecast product was released this morning and goes through next Tuesday morning. This is looking at the total precipitation accumulation we could expect over the next 7 days. And we don't have much activity over Colorado. Those light greens mean very scattered, localized showers where you get a sprinkle, but probably doesn't end up being much in the rain gauge. There might be a couple of localized heavier spots, but overall, a pretty quiet week. The bottom right graph shows, or the bottom right map shows how this week's accumulation compares to average, and it's dry. No big surprise there. We can see that the wetter anomalies really stay to the north and the east of us, and we're going to be pretty mild. It does look like we're going to have a little bit of a cool front come through, but not very cold. So temperatures are going to be really seasonal, and we're not going to have much precip. Extending out to the 8 to 14 day outlook, this is from the Climate Prediction Center, which doesn't give us a specific amount or specific temperature. It just tells you at the end of September, beginning of October, can we expect to have above or below average temperature or precipitation. So on the left side, we're looking at the temperature outlook, and those reds indicate that we are more likely to see above average temperatures as we end the month and go into October. And then the one on the right shows precipitation with a slight leaning to above average precipitation for most of the state, with the Four Corners area showing more likely to be near average. Extending out to the seasonal outlook, and I want to give the caveat that this product was released in mid-August. It only goes out once a month. It's for the September, October, November time period. They'll have a new outlook map released on Thursday this week, and that will be for the October, November, December time period. But this one shows basically that we have a lot of uncertainty with our precipitation outlook on the right side. Some El Nino signal getting in that outlook, particularly if you look to the Pacific Northwest. You can see the no monsoon activity continuing to result in dry conditions into the fall in the Southwest United States, but anybody's guess over Colorado. In terms of temperature on the left side, we're looking at some confidence that we would have above average temperatures, which becomes more confident as you move further to the southwest. All right, so I mentioned the El Nino. This was the El Nino forecast as of a few days ago, or as of Friday, from the Climate Prediction Center, looking at the El Nino forecast. The ocean temperatures, the ocean variables have been very consistent with El Nino, but it says here that the atmosphere is not fully coupled to those sea surface temperature anomalies. And what that means is the atmospheric response that we sometimes expect from an El Nino pattern haven't quite started to occur yet, but it's likely that that will happen in later in the fall, definitely by the winter. So on the left here, we're looking at the likelihood of El Nino conditions in red, La Nina conditions in blue, neutral conditions in gray. 100% likelihood that we're going to be in this El Nino into the winter, and extremely likely that that El Nino is going to continue through the spring and as we go towards the summer. On the right, we're seeing what those individual models are showing for prediction for those ocean temperatures in the tropical Pacific. If you are at a 1 degree anomaly, positive 1 degree sea surface temperature anomaly, that means you're in an El Nino. If you get into the 1.5 to 2 degree mark, you're in a fairly strong El Nino. So a lot of the models are trending towards that strong El Nino. A few of them are staying in that moderate category. So we're looking at either a moderate to strong El Nino basically through the winter. And what does that mean for our upcoming cold season? I'm sharing this graphic that we have in our Climate Change in Colorado report, and this is looking at a general relationship between Colorado's precipitation and the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And I want to give the caveat that this is not a perfect relationship. We know that Colorado experiences a lot of variability. Some of that variability can be explained with El Nino. A lot of it can't be. So this is really just showing that relationship and showing where that's going to kind of nudge us this winter or through the seasons, but that's not necessarily a guarantee of what's going to happen. So if you look at that upper left corner, that December, January, February map is showing that our northern mountains are really favored precipitation wise during an El Nino or La Nina. So they tend to have their wetter conditions during a La Nina winter. Okay, the rest of the maps have red, which means these are areas that tend to be wetter during El Nino. So if you look into the lower right-hand quadrant, that's the September, October, November time period, our fall time period. We tend to be wetter in all those areas during an El Nino. If you look in the upper right corner where we are looking at the spring months, a lot of the Front Range Mountains, Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the West Slope tend to be wetter during an El Nino. So overall, a lot of our state benefits from El Nino conditions, with the exception of the northern mountains. This was from an analysis done that you can find on climate.gov. Just search El Nino winter snow and you'll find this map. Basically, we're looking at when we take El Nino winters and mash them all together, and then compare that to all winters, how does the snowfall compare? So in the top panel, we're looking at strong El Nino winters compared to all winters. And on the bottom, we're looking at all El Ninos versus all winters. And so I'm going to focus on the strong El Nino one to highlight that signal. Over Colorado, you can see that we get that below average snowfall signature showing up over the northern mountains of Colorado, with the southern mountains, the Front Range Mountains, and the eastern plains getting above average snow during those strong El Nino events. This is another product I like to look at, which looks at the risk of having a wet or dry extreme during an El Nino or La Nina. So this is for the fall. What is the risk that you're going to have a wet or dry extreme? And for El Nino falls for Colorado, we have an increased risk of getting wet extremes and a decreased risk of getting dry extremes. So this would suggest that drought development would be unlikely during this time period. And where we have drought, it would be less likely that that drought would get worse during this time period. Doesn't mean it can't happen, it's just less likely. And as we go into the winter, December, January, February, I want to focus on Wyoming and Montana really popping out that they get those increased risk of dry extremes. And that can extend down into the northwest corner of our state, into the northern mountains. The reason it doesn't here is because that climate division for the Colorado River encompasses the northern and the southern, kind of averages out. But overall, I would say that that risk of a dry extreme extends into our northern mountains and northwest portion of our state. And then you see that increased risk for wet extremes in the southwestern part of the country, and along the high plains. And so that would indicate that we're more likely to get wet extremes in parts of our state during the winter and less likely to have drought development. What I would take from this map is our most likely area for drought development in the winter would be in the northwestern portion of our state. So here's key takeaways from my presentation. Current conditions as we progress through the fall, overall, pretty decent. We still have an active precipitation patterns. Temperatures have not been too hot. The soils have dried in some spot, but not really bad. We have developing and worsening drought occurring right now in the Southwest and San Luis Valley. As for the start to the snowpack season, that seasonal temperature outlook indicates that we could have a later start because we're going to have those warmer temperatures. But with the current conditions we've had, the hope is that that will keep the soils from drying out too much. And until then, I'm just saying enjoy the fall colors that we will hopefully have. What can we expect with the El Nino? With the favoring of the southern mountains, I would think that drought recovery where we currently have drought is possible. And again, I think that drought development would be more likely for our northern mountains, west of the divide. That relationship, of course, is never perfect. And regardless, as always, you're going to be able to expect cold snaps, very cold times, no matter where you live. And we're going to have those snowy days for sure. That's all I got for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becky. I will, yeah. I'll open it up for questions if anybody has anything they want to ask Becky. Well, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So um, at the beginning of your presentation, when you did the hail reporting, is that through CocoRaw or like how are those reported, those hailstones?
Those are storm reports that get directly ingested by the National Weather Service. So we have storm chasers and storm spotters. There's a whole dense network of these individuals, and they put in those reports that go to each National Weather Service office. And so it's not connected to CocoRa's. It's its own network of trained spotters.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Mhm.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Becky. And I think next on the agenda we have Carl. Let's see, Carl. Yep, there you go.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Becky, as always. Yeah, this time of year, our report's certainly a little more succinct. Certainly also with some overlap with what Becky discusses, but with respect to precipitation, we're certainly going to be focusing in primarily on what's been going on in the mountains at our SNOTEL stations. Also going over the current state of reservoir storage and how that's changed, in some cases quite significantly throughout the water year. And at the end, I'm going to do a bit of a wrap up on how our observed stream flows through that primary April through July snowmelt runoff period turned out. But I will just go ahead and jump on in. Starting up in northwest Colorado in the combined Yampa, White, and North Platte basins. Currently, water year to date precipitation is at 116% of normal. Definitely very significant snowfall this year up through about peak accumulation, and then things largely dried out with some incremental increases. One thing Becky naturally touched well on was really across the western slope how exceptionally dry the month of July was, really late June and into July, and that is no exception up in northwest Colorado. Not a ton for reservoir storage, but both Yamcolo and Stagecoach that we're reporting on here are generally at near normal levels, near that 30-year median value. Going into our long-term time series, going back about 30 years here, can definitely see after several years of well below normal storages, snowmelt runoff this year provided a significant boost, and then over the last several months, generally maintaining in a similar range, a little bit of a drop off from August 1st through September 1st, but maintaining it above normal storage values still with respect to the total volume. Down into the Colorado River Basin, currently water year to date precipitation is 107% of normal. One thing to keep in mind with a lot of these summaries, but particularly with the Colorado, we'll notice this in the South Platte and the Arkansas as well, is definitely significant regional differences within some of these major basins, and also significant differences throughout times of year, with really dramatic changes in precipitation patterns from summer to winter in different parts of it. But really pretty much since the beginning of the calendar year, the Colorado Basin has been maintaining at above normal water year to date precipitation values. Going into reservoir storage, looking very strong, as is pretty much the whole state, which is great news as we approach winter and going into next spring. Really only a handful of reservoirs here holding below normal values, but really nothing too significantly low. We'll see here that after 2020, the big drop there. There has been steady increases over the last several years in total basin storage volumes. So not as much recovery was needed as in other Western Slope basins, but still got a pretty good boost from this year's snowmelt runoff and still maintaining well above normal there. Over into the South Platte. Few interesting things here. First of all, we are currently sitting at 104% of the median water year to date precipitation as we get very close to the end of the water year. You can see throughout the water year, it was really tracking more or less pretty close to that normal curve. And one thing that is kind of interesting looking at this mountain data compared to some of the stuff that Becky noted in her presentation, as well as Front Range residents, is really how much of that precipitation was occurring kind of a little bit more out into the flats. Some of these increases in precipitation weren't quite as dramatic at the SNOTEL stations as I would have anticipated, just based on what's been going on basically all summer, say in the Denver metro area. But overall, pretty near normal conditions as measured by SNOTEL. Looking at reservoir storage, currently very, very plentiful in the South Platte. Really none of these displayed here are holding below normal storage values. And as we can see in our time series, the South Platte is one where really throughout the summer season, every single month has continued to build and build upon that reservoir storage, as one would imagine, largely being helped by significant precipitation accumulations as rain. And as you can see here, we have really just over the last month gotten up to total reservoir storage volumes not seen since it looks like about 2014, 2015. So really, really impressive storage values there. And then even going back further, both current and that 2014, 2015 timeframe is really some of the highest volumes we've seen, or the highest volumes we've seen going back to the early 1990s. So that is certainly pretty considerable and noteworthy on that front. Heading back to the Western Slope in the Gunnison River Basin, water year to date precipitation currently 115% of normal. Really, really significant snowpack accumulations this year, as you can see kind of through this time frame. Here it looks like about end of March did barely touch what would be record values. And then things have kind of dried out from there. Again, similar to much of the Western Slope, pretty much flatlined on precipitation throughout the end of June and through much of July. And kind of slow and steady increases there, but still below normal over the last couple months. Going into reservoir storage, kind of all over the board. Naturally, folks are always interested in Blue Mesa, which is currently sitting right at 100% of normal. Some higher, some lower. But what we will notice here, similar to other Western Slope basins, a bit of a drop off as some of that accumulated water has been sent downstream over the last month, but not too much, still sitting a little bit above normal, but a huge improvement from this rather impressive snowmelt runoff. You can see we were in range of some of the lowest values over the last 30 years going into this spring season. And certainly one of the better single year improvements we've seen over that 30-year time period as well. So that was very much very welcome and very much needed in the Gunnison. A lot of the similar patterns in the Gunnison were at play further in southwest Colorado in the combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan River basins. But I would say even a little bit amplified with respect to what we observed with snowpack, as we can see here with total water year precipitation. In this case, there were several weeks during the late winter, early spring time period where we actually did hit record high accumulated precipitation values, and things have pretty significantly dried out since then. Fortunately, starting to get some more precipitation accumulated as rain over the last couple months. I'm sure folks have seen in the media. We have seen some snow accumulations at the very high elevations so far. I don't believe we've really seen much, if any, significantly recorded at SNOTEL elevations up to about 11,500 feet. So most of this is still going to be in the form of rain, but good to see some of these values going up. One thing to keep in mind is that even after a dry summer, the timing of this precipitation can be quite helpful for next year's water supply situation, with helping to boost some of the soil moisture conditions as we go into winter, which can aid in the snowmelt runoff efficiency going into next spring. And that's something we certainly saw pretty dramatically highlighted over the last 3 years or so, where dry soil conditions going into winter really dampened the stream flow response from what would have commonly been higher with more soil moisture. So good news there is even with a pretty hot, dry summer, hopefully some of this fall rain will help us a bit more down the road. Looking at reservoir storage, most of the smaller reservoirs, I'm saying that in comparison to Navajo, which is quite big, are very near to quite a bit above normal, which is really good to see. And I'm highlighting this because our basin-wide value is, I believe it's the only one in the state that is currently holding below normal total reservoir storage. But that is largely driven by this deficit in Navajo, which still is not too bad. And as we can see here, is quite an improvement over where we've been sitting for the last several years. So again, total basin storage sitting below normal, but a lot of those kind of more medium-sized reservoirs that are more well within the state boundaries are in fact at above normal values. But yeah, big news there is very big and welcome recovery. As you can see here, the last several years during the snowmelt runoff period, very minimal increases, and then that more dramatic response this season was excellent to see. Bumping over east into the upper Rio Grande, currently sitting slightly below normal with respect to water year to date precipitation at 97% of the 30-year median. Was above normal kind of through that late winter and spring time period, and then kind of largely dried out over the last several months. But again, as I mentioned, the timing of this precipitation is definitely encouraging that we are getting some in the fall to hopefully boost those soil moisture values a little bit before the snowpack really starts to accumulate on top of it. I'm looking at reservoir storage. This continental, with respect to the percent of normal, is kind of throwing off the scale here a little bit, but most reservoirs are holding it at pretty near to above normal storage values, with several below. We'll take a look at this. With respect to our long-term time series, good news for the upper Rio Grande, as you can see here, is throughout the last 3 years or so, definitely didn't enter the degree of deficit that we saw in our combined Southwest basins as well as the Gunnison. Was holding below normal, but closer to that. And then over the last 2 years was able to get above normal. And then during this last year, even some further increases in that reservoir storage. On to our final major basin over in the Arkansas. Also sitting at below normal water year-to-date precipitation, but not terribly so, at 95% of that 30-year median. Really big picture, pretty similar pattern we've seen in a lot of the state, with rather dry conditions throughout late June through July, and again, increasing that precipitation throughout the year or throughout the last several months. The Arkansas is one I'd certainly also want to highlight as being highly variable within the major basin. So, you know, as with any of these basin-wide summaries, we are generalizing across quite large areas. But in the Arkansas in particular, we did throughout the entire winter as well as the summer see pretty significant differences north to south in the precipitation we were receiving as snow as well as rain, with the Sangre de Cristos being generally quite a bit more dry than some of the more northerly headwaters. So always important to really dig in a little deeper if you are a water manager or otherwise following water resources, to really make sure you are looking at your sub-basin and some of those local conditions as well. Looking at some of the major reservoirs we report on, Pueblo Reservoir is definitely a big one, sitting well above normal here, which is great to see. But overall, nothing too far below normal. Clear Creek Reservoir and Turquoise Lake are below, but again, not terribly so here as we enter fall and into the winter season. Going into our 30-year time series, similar to some of the Western Slope basins, say the Gunnison and our combined Southwest basins, after 3 years of pretty consistently below normal reservoir storage, not nearly as grim compared to the period of record as some of those other ones. You can see it was a lot closer to normal, but again, got pretty healthy boost in those reservoir storages throughout this late spring and summer season. Excuse me. So going into taking a step back, looking at some of these things on a statewide basis. As we can see here, not all basins are technically at above normal water year-to-date precipitation, but all pretty dang close, with the Upper Rio Grande at 97% and the Arkansas at 95%. Certainly close to that range. A lot of our other Western Slope basins sitting well above normal. But again, this is largely being driven by winter snow accumulation as the summer season really did dry out quite a bit across Western Colorado. And then some of the other ones, the South Platte, Laramie, North Platte, and Colorado headwaters sitting right in the middle. But also encourage folks, as I previously mentioned, to take a look at the actual dots we've got here representing the individual SNOTEL stations, where you can really see there is quite a bit of within basin variability. As I noted, the Sangre de Cristos down here were generally quite a bit more dry than other parts of the Arkansas basin, with the Colorado. Really significant snowpacks were received along the Grand Mesa and up to McClure Pass, whereas other parts of the basin were a little bit more dry, as well as the South Platte, where the main stem headwaters remained quite a bit more dry throughout winter, and also in the summer had some different precipitation accumulation patterns compared to further along the northern Front Range. And naturally, be open to questions, but encourage everyone to dive into these data as deeply as necessary. Using our interactive map product is really a great resource to really hone things in for your local area. So looking at our month-to-date precipitation, just over the last 2.5 weeks or so, certainly strongly favoring kind of the easterly mountain front, the northern Front Range, and on down to the New Mexico border. A lot of the snowtail stations along the Continental Divide there. The Sangre de Cristos aren't necessarily Continental Divide, but they've finally been getting a good boost of precipitation. And then kind of just a mixed bag beyond that with how much precipitation has been received elsewhere in some of these other major basins. And might have to do some follow-up. Even some of these point measurements in the Yampa White Little Snake, I will say, at a glance are not really aligning up with that basin-wide number, but hopefully that is accurate to some degree, and I will follow up on that. But point being, this time of year, with a lot of convective storms driving things, it is not uncommon for quite a bit of spatial variability in when and where precipitation does happen to fall. Statewide, currently sitting at 108% of normal, which again is that 30-year median value. Averaged across the state, you can kind of see pretty steady increases. Some of that extreme dryness that was observed on the western slope through June and July does show kind of still a bit of a slope there, averaged out with some of the more easterly snowtail stations contributing. So this is taking a step back, looking at reservoir storage, how it was on July 1st. And what I wanted to highlight here was, and I'll jump up to September 1st here in a second, but how we really have seen those percent of normal storage values stabilize across the western slope, but with still continuing quite significant increases in storage over the last several months in the South Platte, Arkansas, and Upper Rio Grande. So, or Upper Rio Grande changed colors, but didn't have an incredibly significant increase, but quite a bit more water still accumulating in South Platte and Arkansas Basin reservoirs over the last several months, which is great to see. Going back to our 30-year time series, you can kind of see this. I'll touch base on a couple things. I'll just mention this first. You'll notice we did add a couple, just for reservoir storage, I believe, a couple more categories, including Eastern South Platte and the Eastern Arkansas. I was on leave for this conversation, but I believe this was a request. I'm not sure from who, but to add some of those separate categories, because most of our other parameters, when say looking at snowpack, precipitation, and our stream flow forecast points, are all going to be in the mountains or very near the mountain front. But we are reporting on a lot of reservoir storage in the Arkansas and South Platte that is further east out into the plains. So I believe that was a request, and which makes sense to me, to kind of separate that out a little bit more. And you know, we'll still have the data available for all of those subcategories separately and everything, but thought I would point that out, that we do now have a separation from the greater basin as well as some of those more easterly ones. Sorry, I need to follow up with some of the other staff who are part of that conversation to get some more details. But basically, and also apologies that part of that is with that change. Now this color ramp has quite a few of these oranges, which look pretty similar. But this bottom line over here is our total cumulative statewide volumetric storage, which you can see really increased back up to those above normal values statewide, which is awesome. I believe we've been at above normal storage statewide since July 1st, which is the first time in a little over 3 years. And as you can see here, with this red trace being our combined Southwest basins and this orange one being the Gunnison, largely driving that statewide storage value back up. this is just a comparison from this year to last year, at the beginning of September, end of August, as it's noted here. One thing to note, when you're looking at the numbers, this is one product where we're actually looking at percent of capacity as opposed to percent of normal. But take home point here is really across the board. Current water year 2023 is in this blue color. Really significant increases in every individual basin, as well as our statewide. So that has been excellent to see, after quite a bit of depletion in several of our basins over the last several years. So we'll just take a quick look back at how some of our April through July period volumetric stream flows panned out. So I'm sure most folks who attend these meetings are aware that's obviously going to be the primary snowmelt runoff season, but also the primary time period for the majority of our seasonal water supply forecasts. You can see the upper Rio Grande, a lot of those volumetric forecasts do extend into September in some cases, so they're not completely represented here, but very significant runoff volumes observed across Western Colorado. I've got another metric coming up next to take a look at that, but upper Rio Grande, with the points represented here, 176% of normal, 168 in our Southwest basins, 164% of normal in the Gunnison, 154% in the Yampa White Little Snake. Really impressive stream flow volumes coming out this year. South Platte and Arkansas are generally more near normal. Certainly got some help from summer precipitation, even over what was anticipated or what was forecasted rather. And we will also take a little bit of a closer look at that here in a couple slides. So this is looking at just point by point our stream flow data, and what we're displaying here with the numbers as well as the color ramp is the percentile of observed stream flow. So just kind of a different way to look at the data as opposed to the percent of normal, put it in a little bit more of a historic context. Some of the things I want to point out here, primarily all along the western slope, really a pretty significant number of these stream flow forecast points observed above their 90th percentile of observed stream flow. Looks like the North Fork of the Gunnison here had its highest on record. A lot of them, I think, were, second, third, fourth, fifth highest on record. And with these also bearing in mind when we're doing these period of record comparisons for stream flow, these data go back quite a bit further than our SNOTEL data that we commonly look at. I'd say most of these are probably going back at least 50, some to 100, or I know certainly in some cases more than 100 years. So when we're seeing more than 90th percentile observed stream flow compared to a full period of record, that's very significant. Something worth noting. So thought I'd just kind of put a little bit of a different context on there with the percentile metric. So the last thing we'll just take a quick look at with respect to stream flow is this is our stream flow forecast error. I believe this was from the April 1st forecast. My apologies. Or no, this is June, from our June forecasts. But you can see across the western slope, most of these forecasts verified pretty well, single digits, really a good chunk of them with less than 5% error. Where we do see more error in those forecasts is in the South Platte here. But I think that's pretty, as folks I'm sure are well aware at this point, pretty easily explainable by the really substantial summer rainfalls that have occurred. So these forecasts are largely driven by what was observed in the snowpack, as well as mountain precipitation in general, but some of those continuing precipitation trends along the Front Range certainly help to boost those, leading the observed stream flows to be above their forecasted values. So just a quick summary. I think most of these points have been hit pretty well, but water year-to-date precipitation across the entire state was either very, very near normal or well above normal. Really, one of the most interesting things this water year was the temporal discrepancies, with the western slope receiving the majority of their precipitation as winter snowpack and then considerably dried out, whereas some of the mountainous areas further to the east received quite a bit less snowpack, but quite a bit more summer precipitation. Statewide reservoir storage, again, great news, has been at above normal levels for the past 3 months, which is a pretty significant shift over the last 3 years. I believe it was May 2020, the last time we were at barely above normal statewide total reservoir storage. So that's been fantastic to see. And then April through July stream flows were near normal in the Arkansas and South Platte basins, and generally above normal to well above normal across much of the rest of the state. And yeah, I didn't crunch the exact number of, like say how many of those stream flow forecast points were above the 90th percentile or some other benchmark, but you could certainly even tell at a glance. It was really impressive volumes that came down a lot of those western slope rivers compared to the period of record. And that is all I have. I am happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Carl. It's nice to see from both presentations all that data to just get a full picture of what happened during this water year. So yeah, if anybody has questions for Carl, go ahead.
Yeah, I would add on. It was interesting to me. It's always interesting seeing the presentation from the Climate Center, but even some of the different trends with their measurements in the lower elevations as well. Some of the differences between what we see at our mountain stations compared to what's been observed at some of the lower elevations with respect to precipitation was really interesting also.
Mm-hmm. Yes, agreed. Becky agrees. Okay, cool. Well, if there's no questions for Carl, we can get into updates from water providers, water managers, municipalities, and water conservancy districts. So if we have any volunteers, that would be great, or I can start calling.
This is Swithin with Highland Ranch. Everything is, well, as Becky said, the South Platte Basin has had a really good summer. That's translated to below normal demands on our system. And so we have very healthy levels in our reservoirs and no concerns or worries at this time. Looking good going into the winter.
Great, thank you so much.
I can jump in. This is Jordan Soldano with Denver Water. Kind of a similar story here. Our current reservoir storage is 92% full, and our normal would be about 89% full. And then similar story with our demands. Our customers have really responded to the cool and wet weather, and we've seen lower demands this year. Yeah, nothing else major to report.
Thanks, Jordan. Let's see. Lisa from Castle Rock. Any updates? Nope. All right. What about Josh.
Hello.
Hi.
Similar story for us too. Good conditions with above average storage and lower demand. So looking good for this season and into the winter. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think that'll conclude today's meeting. Just to note that next meeting will be in November on Tuesday, November 28th. So I will see you all in 2 months. Thanks again to Becky and Carl. See you.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for listening, everybody.
Thanks all.